Well, it's clear that this was all planned in advance. You don't have a State of the Nation address at which you signal constitutional change and then have the entire government and its Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev resign basically within an hour or so of the end of that speech without that having been agreed in advance. This is clearly quite orchestrated. Deputy Prime Minister is on TV now explaining the reason for the government standing down. The Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, who is very unpopular, only 38% of people in the country approve of him as Prime Minister. He's explaining that he and the rest of the government have to go to make room for Mr. Putin to proceed with those constitutional changes, which will require a referendum, as already signalled earlier in the day. It's also clear in what President Putin said. President Putin was sat next to the Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev on state TV when this announcement was made within the last hour. He said he accepted the resignation and perhaps in a reference to those low popularity ratings, said that the government had tried its best, but not everything had gone according to plan. So it's clear that, as I was saying earlier today in the previous broadcast, that President Putin sees the need for change to make the regime more palatable to the public. There have been increasing public protests in recent years, principally over the wide-ranging pension reforms, over landfill and waste management, medicines for the elderly. A whole host of policies have upset members of the public. People have been out on the streets demonstrating, and not only the normal protesters, the people who, the opposition youngsters who are always on the streets protesting against various government issues, the cancellation of the number of candidates in last year's Moscow local elections, for example. There have been widespread protests, and it's quite obvious that President Putin wants to make the Russian government more attractive to the public. And by signalling those changes in the speech earlier today and then immediately following that up with pulling this rabbit out of the hat, the resignation of an unpopular Prime Minister and his government, Putin is ensuring that the public, that he at least retains the public's respect and popularity, and that he can push forward with changes that clearly he believes will maintain his role, his government in Russia's policies. He signalled that he wants to limit the presidential term to 2 terms. He will likely stand down in 2024. I think what he's doing now is preparing the ground for ensuring that there's a successor of his choice in place in 2024. It's significant that he's proposing that the Parliament will be able to choose the next Prime Minister and senior members of the Cabinet, but the President will have the right to dismiss those if he wishes. So this is clearly a change of the guard, but also a kind of way of ensuring the continuity of the regime.
Nick, very briefly, do we know when the Russian president plans on holding this referendum? Because I understand that he wants to pass more power onto the lawmakers. But for now, it seems that Vladimir Putin is going to keep on to the power because he's going to nominate the next government.
Well, exactly. It hasn't been made clear when that constitutional referendum will take place, but given the pace of the changes today, one would suspect that the proposals that Mr. Putin outlined earlier are already fairly well advanced, and we can expect to see that constitutional referendum, I would think, within the next 2 to 3 months.
Nick, thank you very much for that update. Nick Holdsworth reporting there from Moscow for us.